They came dressed for grief, but their eyes were hungry. The Kincaid family hadn't been under one roof in 3 years, except for one Sunday when Grandma Lily demanded a photograph before she sold the Summer Lake house. That was the last time they smiled together, the kind of practiced porcelain smile that cracks as soon as the flash fades. Now she was gone, and the only thing left unspoken in the marble-cold halls of her mansion was who gets what. The long driveway of 14 Carousel Road glittered with rainwater and chrome. Black cars lined up like mourners in a parade that cared more about inheritance than loss. The air carried the scent of wet pine and tension. Even the wind seemed to hush before crossing the threshold of the old woman's estate. Inside, the grandfather clock struck noon with a sound that sliced through the silence, deep, heavy, and judgmental. Every chime was a reminder. The time for pretending to love her had finally expired. Keith Kincaid was the first to walk in. 32, sharply dressed, watch too bright, confidence rehearsed. The kind of man who called debt temporary leverage, and kindness a bad investment. He ran a hand over the walnut banister and smiled as though he already owned it. His grandmother used to say, "Some people polish the wood they didn't build." Keith never understood that until later. The others trailed behind Delaney, whose eyes darted like a thief's every time money was mentioned. Miguel, the charming cousin who somehow owed everyone in the room a small fortune. Mallory, who had called Grandma's health decline a long goodbye, while secretly searching Zillow for the property value. And Bruce, the eldest, who believed he deserved more simply because he was born first. Every one of them was convinced that love had a price tag, and today was payday. The library doors were shut when they arrived. The lawyer Martin Harrow stood beside them, coat neatly buttoned, expression unreadable. He'd served the Kincaid family for 21 years, long enough to know that every kind smile from them came with a request attached. His voice, calm but unyielding, carried the weight of someone who had buried more secrets than clients. Mrs. Kincaid requested the reading take place in her home, he said. She believed the walls remember what people forget. Keith smirked. Let's just hope the walls can afford property tax. No one laughed, but no one stopped him either. When the doors opened, the room swallowed them whole. Dust danced in the light slicing through the tall windows. The leather chairs gleamed like polished pride. On the fireplace mantel sat a photo of Grandma Lily smiling faintly, as though she already knew what was coming. Beneath it, a crystal bowl of peppermints and a handwritten note, "Help yourselves." Delaney reached for one, unwrapping it too fast. The candy slipped, bounced once on the floor, and rolled beneath the desk. The sound echoed longer than it should have. Martin cleared his throat. "We'll begin." He spread the documents like a priest preparing an altar. "Your grandmother was a thorough woman. She made revisions over the years, some small, some significant." He lifted a thin stack of papers and a sealed yellow envelope. "We'll read the will in sequence." As he began, the rhythm was predictable. Donations to the church. Scholarships for underprivileged youth. $50,000 to the nurse who had cared for her at Maple Ridge Care and Recovery. That last name made Bruce frown. It wasn't family. And then came the properties. The farmhouse in Medina sold. The lake cabin gifted to charity. The jewelry divided equally among those who visit my grave once a year. Lily always did have a sharp tongue, even from the grave. Keith adjusted his tie and waited for the big reveal. The house, the savings, the stocks, the real inheritance. He imagined himself signing documents, maybe even selling the place to developers. He could almost hear the champagne cork pop in his head. But the lawyer's voice slowed. The remainder of Mrs. Kincaid's estate, including her personal savings, residence, and investment accounts, will be distributed as specified. He stopped, not dramatically, but deliberately. The room tilted toward him. Everyone leaned in. Delaney whispered, "Well, go on," but Martin didn't. Not yet. He glanced down at the yellow envelope, and then back up at the family. "There's an addendum," he said quietly. "A second instruction, written by Mrs. Kincaid 6 weeks before she passed." "What kind of instruction?" Keith asked, his tone thin with irritation. Martin laid a hand on the envelope. Her words were clear. She said. He paused, reading the handwriting on the front. "To be opened only when the will is read, and all the faces have shown their true colors." Silence crawled across the room. Outside, thunder rolled over Carousel Road. Keith's smirk faltered. "So, what, she left another will?" "No," Martin replied. "Something smaller. Something final." The envelope looked harmless, no thicker than a grocery receipt, but the weight of it pressed on the room like invisible hands. Everyone's breath synced to the rhythm of the rain hitting the windows. Belle murmured, "She always did love a performance." Martin gave a faint smile. "She did, and she rehearsed this one carefully." He held up the letter, its paper trembling in the dim light. "She said there were two kinds of wealth in life, one you count, and one that counts you back. I think today we'll learn which one lasts longer." The airs shifted uncomfortably. The clock struck 12:30. The peppermint under the desk had melted into a sticky red smear. Martin broke the seal. The envelope hissed open, soft and slow, and before a single word was read, every person in that room knew one thing for certain. Whatever was inside that envelope was not money. It was judgment wrapped in paper, signed with love, and mailed from beyond the grave. The letter was opened, but not yet read. For a moment nobody breathed. The sound of paper unfolding felt louder than the rain against the windows. Every air in that room was waiting for confirmation that their greed would finally be justified. Keith leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the picture of false patience. His jaw worked slowly, the way a man chews on pride he's not ready to swallow. He expected numbers, property titles, something measurable. But when Martin began to read, there were no digits. Only words. "To my family," the lawyer's voice steadied. "If you are hearing this, then I am gone. And if you're together under my roof again, it's not because you wanted to be, but because of what you think I left behind." The words landed like small knives. Delaney crossed her legs, eyes darting to the floor. Bruce looked out the window, pretending to watch the rain. Only Keith stared straight ahead, unblinking. Martin continued, "When I was alive, I watched how you treated me, and how you treated each other. Some of you called it tough love. I called it calculation. I once told a friend that my family only visited when the Wi-Fi broke or when I forgot to lock my jewelry drawer." A ripple of discomfort moved across the room. Mallory's fingers twisted her bracelet until it cut into her skin. Miguel chuckled nervously, trying to play it off. Keith forced a grin. She always had a sense of humor. Martin glanced at him. "It gets better," he said flatly, and went on. "To my grandson Keith, I once hoped you'd take over the family estate. I believed that confidence was the same as character. I was wrong. You spoke of opportunity while borrowing against everyone else's kindness. You said you were busy working toward success, yet never found time to visit an old woman who built the life you now take for granted." The smirk fell from Keith's face. His ears turned red. He wanted to stand, to interrupt. But the room had grown smaller, heavier. Everyone was watching him now. For the first time he felt like the topic of a eulogy he hadn't approved. Martin's voice didn't soften. The will promised wealth, but a second envelope rewrote what inheritance means. The phrase echoed, that same line printed in the letter's margin like an epitaph. Everyone looked up, confusion spreading like static. "What does that mean?" Bruce asked. "Another document," Martin nodded slowly. "An addendum, an additional clause." He reached for a thinner folder beneath the letter, stamped with Lily's neat signature. She left very precise instructions. Delaney exhaled sharply. "So, who gets what?" Martin's gaze swept the room. "You'll want to hear this part." He unfolded the addendum, reading each line deliberately. "Each member of my immediate family listed below." He paused. "That includes everyone here. Will have their inheritance placed in a trust account, held for 12 months. During that time, you are required to complete 1,000 hours of volunteer work at Maple Ridge Care and Recovery, the same nursing home where I spent my last year." The air left the room. Belle's mouth fell open. Miguel muttered, "You're kidding." Mallory's voice cracked. "Volunteer work. For a whole year." Martin didn't flinch. "There's more." He read on, "Your service must be performed without pay, without media coverage, and without excuse. You are to assist the elderly residents as I once was assisted by bathing, cleaning, feeding, and listening. Your progress will be documented by the facility administrator. Only after these terms are met will your inheritance be released in full." A pin could have dropped and echoed through the estate. Keith shot to his feet. "This is insane. She can't legally do that." Martin met his eyes. "Actually, she can, and she did. I notarized it myself." Laughter rippled faintly from one corner, Delaney half hysterical. "So Grandma turned her will into a punishment. She turned it into a mirror," Martin replied. You can choose not to participate, but according to her final instruction, any heir who refuses forfeits their share permanently. Keith's face hardened. You think I'm scrubbing floors for strangers? No chance. Martin placed the letter gently on the desk. Then you'll walk away with nothing. For a moment the only sound was thunder. Then as if on cue the fireplace cracked, a small burst of heat in a cold room. The irony burned sharper than the flame. Lily's letter continued. When I was placed in Maple Ridge, I asked each of you to visit. Some of you sent flowers, others sent excuses. But flowers die, and excuses don't hug you back. If you want my inheritance, you will now meet the people who did what you wouldn't, those who held my hand when I couldn't remember my own name. Mallory covered her mouth. Bruce muttered a curse under his breath. Keith stood frozen, jaw locked, hands trembling behind his back. Martin folded the paper neatly. Her condition is binding. You can laugh, argue, or storm out. But the second envelope changed everything. I suggest you think before reacting. Keith broke the silence first. You think she did this to teach us a lesson?
Stay.
Martin looked down at the letter again. No, she did it to make you feel one. Outside, lightning flashed white across the drenched lawn, illuminating Lily's portrait above the fireplace. Her painted eyes seemed to follow them, calm and knowing, as though she had just witnessed her first act of justice. Delaney whispered. She planned this. Every word. Yes, Martin said. Even the part where you'd call it unfair. He gathered the documents back into the folder and shut it with a quiet finality. We reconvene in 1 year. Same date, same time. Those who fulfill the clause will be present for the final distribution. Those who don't will not. No one moved. No one spoke. Only Keith's breathing grew loud in the heavy silence, sharp as a knife dragged slowly across pride. When the family finally left the mansion, rain had turned the driveway into a sheet of reflection. Every car door that slammed echoed like a chapter closing. But above them, on the top floor, a light flickered in Lily's old room, the one no one had entered since she passed. It stayed on until morning. 3 days after the will reading, the family group chat died quietly. No one wanted to be the first to message, not after the humiliation they'd endured in front of each other. And the lawyer, the silence was its own punishment. But on the 4th morning, a thick brown envelope arrived at each of their doorsteps, sealed with the same neat cursive, Maple Ridge Care and Recovery. Volunteer orientation. Inside were printed schedules, volunteer forms, and a note in Martin Harrow's handwriting. Mrs. Kincaid requested your first day begin this Friday. 8 a.m. attendance will be confirmed. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a summons. By Friday morning, the rain had returned, slow, deliberate, unhurried. Keith stood in the parking lot of Maple Ridge, staring at the faded sign above the entrance. The paint had peeled to gray, the letters E and D, half gone, like the building itself had grown tired of asking for attention. His hands were shoved in his pockets, jaw tight. He'd thought about not showing up, thought about calling his lawyer, but every call he made led back to the same answer. The clause was airtight. Walk away, and he'd lose everything. So here he was, standing before the same nursing home where he'd once left his grandmother in a rush, muttering something about meetings in Cleveland that didn't exist. He wasn't alone. Mallory pulled up in a silver Lexus, sunglasses on despite the clouds. Miguel showed up late, shirt half tucked, smelling like cologne and excuses. Delaney came last, carrying a notepad as if volunteering required business minutes. No one greeted anyone. They were soldiers drafted into an army they didn't respect. Inside, the building smelled faintly of disinfectant and oatmeal. A soft hum came from the vending machine, and the distant crackle of a radio played Moon River in another room. Behind the reception desk sat a woman in pale blue scrubs, with kind eyes but no trace of pity. Her name tag read, Mrs. Anders, Director of Resident Affairs. Welcome, she said calmly. You're the Kincaid volunteers, I presume. No one answered. She smiled anyway. Good. You'll be starting in Ward C. Breakfast service. You'll each be assigned a resident. She pointed toward a cart stacked with plastic trays, steam rising from under the lids. Today you serve. Tomorrow you listen. That's what your grandmother requested. Delaney frowned. She requested this. Mrs. Anders didn't blink. Every detail, including the shifts, including the cameras. Cameras, Keith repeated. Security cameras, she said evenly. Installed last month. Your grandmother paid for them. She said accountability builds character. It was the first time Keith realized that Grandma Lily hadn't written her revenge in anger. She'd written it in precision. Ward C was a long hall that smelled faintly of lavender and antiseptic. Wheelchairs lined the wall, each one holding a story wrapped in wrinkles and slow breaths. Some residents stared blankly at the TV. Others watched the newcomers with quiet amusement. Start at the end of the hall, Mrs. Anders instructed. Help them eat. Help them talk. They'll tell you what they need. Delaney wrinkled her nose. You can't be serious, ma'am, Mrs. Anders said, her tone soft but final. This is the easy part. Keith grabbed a tray and followed the instructions, his hands trembling as he set it down before a frail man with silver hair. The man looked up, his eyes clear as glass. You're Lily's grandson, he said. Keith froze. You knew her? Everyone here did. The man smiled faintly. She talked about you every Sunday. Said you were busy, but she believed you'd come around. Keith swallowed hard. She said that? She said you'd learn kindness the hard way. The old man chuckled, a sound soft enough to hurt. Across the hall, Mallory spilled oatmeal on a resident's blanket. The woman, nearly 90, said gently. It's all right, dear. I used to make messes too. But when Mallory looked down, she realized the woman's hands were shaking from arthritis, and she was still trying to comfort her. The humiliation was thick and slow, not the loud kind that bursts in front of a crowd, but the quiet kind that crawls under your skin and sits there. By noon, the heirs were sweating through designer clothes. Their manicures were chipped, their tempers thin, and their sense of superiority cracked open. When the shift ended, Mrs. Anders handed them each a time card. 8 hours a day. 1,000 in total. The cameras don't lie, Keith muttered. This is ridiculous. She tilted her head. Your grandmother thought so too, at first. What's that supposed to mean? Mrs. Anders smiled faintly. She said her family thought hard work was beneath them. So she decided to build a will that made humility impossible to avoid. That night, Keith drove home in silence. His reflection in the windshield looked older somehow, like the day had carved something into his face that water couldn't wash off. He sat in the dark driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. On the counter lay an unopened envelope from Martin Harrow, labeled Weekly Compliance Form. He ripped it open. Inside was a single line in Lily's handwriting, scanned and printed. True wealth isn't measured by what you earn, it's measured by what you endure. For a moment he thought about crumpling it, but instead he pinned it to the fridge with a magnet. The following week, another twist arrived. The local paper, the Brookfield Herald, ran a front-page story. The Kincaid family gives back. A legacy of compassion begins. A photo beneath the headline showed the four of them in uniform, pushing food carts, forced smiles frozen mid-blink. The humiliation had gone public. Martin Harrow had approved the press release. It was part of the clause. Keith's phone buzzed non-stop with texts from friends, co-workers and an ex-girlfriend who wrote, "Wow and tearing now. Didn't see that coming." He wanted to disappear. But Grandma Lily had built her revenge like a clock. Every tick was a reminder that money can't save you from your reflection. And the reflection was just beginning to stare back. Winter came early to Brookfield that year. The kind that stiffens bones and drains color from the sky. And for the Kincaid heirs, it brought more than cold, it brought consequence. The first month at Maple Ridge had been awkward. The second, unbearable. By the third, humiliation had turned into something heavier. Routine. Each morning, at 7:45, the family clocked in under Mrs. Anders' watchful gaze. Their designer coats hung beside janitor uniforms that smelled faintly of bleach and oatmeal. The irony was poetic. Hands that once signed deals now scrubbed cafeteria trays. Voices that once barked orders now said, "Yes, ma'am," to women in wheelchairs. Keith, who had spent his adult life avoiding anything that resembled humility, had become the face of the humiliation. The nursing staff whispered that he was the proud one, the one who parked his car, farthest from the entrance, as if distance could separate him from shame. But what humbles a man faster than repetition? By February he'd stopped wearing his watch. By March, he'd stopped checking his reflection in the elevator mirror. Something inside him had begun to bend, but not yet break. One morning, Mrs. Anders handed him a clipboard and said, "You're on bathing duty today, room 207. He froze. "You mean, I have to?" "Yes," she said plainly. "You assist, you don't complain, and you treat that resident like you'd treat your own grandmother." The words hit harder than she knew. Because room 207 had once been Grandma Lily's. The room had been redecorated since her passing. New curtains, a vase of fake flowers, and a single photo on the nightstand of the new resident, a frail woman named Mrs. North. When Keith entered, she looked up with tired eyes, and said softly, "You're Lily's boy, aren't you?" He nodded once, throat dry. "You knew her, the woman smiled faintly. She used to sit right there by that window, every morning at 9, waiting for someone who never came." He didn't need her to say the name. The silence did it for her. Mrs. North reached for his hand. She wasn't angry, just disappointed. Said love can't grow in soil watered by pride. He felt the words burrow deep, deeper than he wanted them to. Elsewhere in the facility, Delaney cracked under pressure first. She couldn't stand the smell, the work, the noise. One afternoon, when an old man spilled soup on her shoes, she snapped, called him clumsy. Mrs. Anders saw it, wrote it down. "Strike one," she said evenly. Delaney lasted another week before storming out and never returning. Her forfeiture letter arrived 3 days later, inheritance revoked, her exit sent tremors through the rest of them. It wasn't about money anymore, it was about dignity. The humiliation was public, and none of them wanted to be next. Miguel tried to fake his hours, signing timesheets he hadn't earned. He was caught when the cameras, Lily's cameras, showed him leaving early. His revocation came quietly, via email. No appeal, no second chance. By April only 2 remained. Keith and Mallory. Mallory had changed in her own quiet way. She'd stopped complaining and started listening. She learned the names of the residents, their birthdays, their stories. Sometimes she stayed late just to read to a woman with cataracts, who said her voice reminded her of rain. When Keith saw that, something inside him stirred, a shame not of exposure, but of absence. Why had it taken this long to notice that kindness didn't make a person small? It made them real. He started to do more than required. He brought small things, magazines, sugar-free candies, even crossword puzzles. Mrs. Anders said nothing, but she noticed. And one evening, when the shift ended, she handed him a folder with a single sheet inside. It was a printed copy of his grandmother's medical report from her final week. At the bottom, a note in her own handwriting. "He'll come when he's ready. I just hope I'm still here to see it." He sat in his car in the empty parking lot that night, headlights off, eyes wet. For the first time in years, he whispered her name out loud. Summer arrived with a strange lightness. The scent of lilacs replaced the smell of disinfectant near the entrance. Residents laughed more, so did staff. And the 2 remaining Kincaids, Keith and Mallory, became part of that rhythm. But redemption never comes without one last test. In August, a storm hit Brookfield hard. Power outages, flooded streets. Maple Ridge's backup generator failed, leaving the entire East Wing in darkness. The staff scrambled, but 2 nurses were trapped behind a collapsed ceiling panel. Panic spread. Keith and Mallory didn't think twice. They grabbed flashlights and went in. They cleared debris, guided patients to safety, and even carried one resident, a man in his 80s, down 2 flights of stairs. When firefighters arrived, they found Keith covered in plaster dust, holding an oxygen tank steady while Mallory pressed gauze against a nurse's arm. By dawn, local news crews gathered. Cameras flashed. The headline the next morning read, "Heirs of late Lily Kincaid save dozens, during nursing home blackout." It wasn't part of the clause, but somehow it was exactly what she'd wanted. Humiliation had forged something the will alone never could. Humanity. Weeks later, Mrs. Anders called a short meeting in her office. The year was nearly over. Only 2 names had met the full requirement. "Your grandmother would be proud," she said softly. "Not because you finished, but because you finally understood." Keith looked at the clipboard one last time. Every box checked. "Every hour earned," she said. Mrs. Anders added, opening a final sealed letter from her drawer, "that when the work stops feeling like punishment, you'll know you're ready for the real inheritance." The letter was addressed simply, to those who stayed. He didn't read it right away. He just stood in the hallway, watching the sunrise spill through the glass. For once, it didn't feel like the light was judging him. It felt like forgiveness. But across town, at the mansion on Carousel Road, a locksmith was busy at work, changing every lock and signing new paperwork. The deed had already been transferred, to someone none of them expected. A year to the day after the will was read, the Kincaid family gathered once more. But this time, the mood was different. No fancy suits, no polished cars, no sense of entitlement. The rain that had marked the first reading was gone. The sun hung low behind the mansion's chimneys, throwing gold across the gravel. Only two heirs arrived, Keith and Mallory. The rest had either forfeited their shares, or been stripped of them for deceit. Keith parked his old pickup beside the fountain. The Escalade was long gone, sold 6 months earlier to pay off credit cards he no longer needed. He stepped out in a plain shirt, no watch, no swagger. Just a man who had finally learned what silence sounds like when it isn't hiding guilt. Mallory waited by the door. She smiled, faintly. "Guess it's just us." He nodded. "Guess so." Inside, the library was exactly as they'd left it, except for one thing. On the desk sat a wooden box, carved with initials, LK, and beside it a smaller envelope. Pale cream, sealed with red wax. Martin Harrow was already there, sitting behind the desk, glasses low on his nose. He rose as they entered. "Welcome back," he said softly. "A year ago you came here expecting wealth. Today you've earned something else." He gestured for them to sit. The two took their places, the same ones they'd occupied the year before, except this time, there was no hierarchy between them. Martin unlatched the wooden box. Inside were two things, a small silver key and a folded letter on thick stationery. He read it aloud, every word steady and deliberate. "To my family, if you are reading this, then you have walked the road I built. I warned you it would be hard. I knew some would quit, but those who remained, those who stayed the course, have done something rare. They've turned humiliation into humility." He paused, looked up briefly at Keith. "She wrote that line herself, no edits." Then he continued, "You have scrubbed floors, fed strangers, and stood face to face with the loneliness you once ignored. I asked for a year, not because I wanted to punish you, but because I wanted to see if your hands could remember what gratitude feels like." Mallory's eyes glistened. Keith sat motionless, but his throat worked as he swallowed hard. "This key unlocks the last part of your inheritance," Martin said, lifting it from the box, "the safe behind the portrait." He stood and walked to the painting above the fireplace. Lily Kincaid's portrait, the same one whose eyes had followed them the day of the first reading. He swung it open to reveal a narrow safe. The key turned easily. Inside a single brown envelope rested, labeled simply, "Final Class." Martin carried it back to the table, and broke the seal. "My estate, my savings and my holdings are not to be divided. They are to be given in full to the one who fulfilled their hours in both letter and spirit, and who performed one final act without being told to." He looked up. "Does that sound familiar?" Keith frowned. Mallory blinked. "The storm," she whispered. Martin smiled faintly. "Exactly. Maple Ridge sent a report to the board. Said both of you risked your lives during the blackout. Your grandmother predicted something like that might happen. She said the world has a way of testing sincerity." He continued reading. "To my granddaughter Mallory, you found gentleness again. You reminded me that kindness runs in the bloodline, even when pride tries to choke it. You've inherited something that can't be stolen. Peace of heart. Hold on to it." Mallory exhaled, tears streaking silently down her face. Then came the next line. "To my grandson Keith, you were the mirror I feared to face. I watched you trade your integrity for ambition, your compassion for control, but you came back to where it all began. You didn't just serve, you changed." Martin paused again, voice tightening slightly as he reached the final paragraph. "For that reason, the estate at Carousel Road, all its contents, and all associated accounts shall transfer in your name, with one condition. You must never sell it. You will keep it open to those who need rest, kindness or second chances. Call it what you will. I call it redemption." The room fell quiet. Keith's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Mallory reached over and took his hand before he could speak. Martin closed the letter and placed it in front of him. "She left you the house, Keith, but not the house you remember. It's yours only if you keep her promise alive." He nodded slowly, eyes wet. "I will," he said. "I swear I will." Martin looked satisfied. "Then I believe you've just inherited more than property." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Keith walked through the empty halls of the mansion. The light fell across the wooden floors like liquid gold. Every creak under his boots echoed years of arrogance, and now something else: atonement. In the kitchen he found an old teacup, still sitting on a shelf. The rim was chipped, but the pattern, small blue forget-me-nots, was still bright. He filled it with water, set it on the counter, and whispered, "I remembered." Outside, Mallory stood in the driveway, watching through the window. The man who had once called humility weakness, now looked like someone rebuilt from the ground up. For the first time in years, the Kincaid estate didn't feel haunted, it felt alive again. Months later, a new sign appeared at the gate. Kincaid Haven, a place to begin again. The mansion that once symbolized greed became a sanctuary for the elderly who had no one. The dining room became a common hall. The bedrooms were converted into guest rooms. Keith ran it himself, with Mallory managing donations. Every morning, he walked the halls his grandmother once walked and greeted residents by name. Every night, before locking up, he paused by her portrait, whispering, "Thank you for not giving up on me." And behind that portrait, taped inside the safe door, was one final note no one had read until then. Written in her familiar cursive, the will promised wealth, then a second envelope rewrote what inheritance means. "If you're reading this, it means you finally understood. I never wanted to leave you money. I wanted to leave you mercy." The story spread through Brookfield. Reporters came. Grandson turns inherited mansion into care home in honor of grandmother's legacy. The town called it inspiring. The family called it justice. But in truth it was something deeper. It was an old woman's final victory, written not in gold or marble, but in the quiet transformation of the very air who once broke her heart. And in the stillness of the night, when the wind swept through the pine trees around the mansion, one could almost hear her laughter in the leaves. Gentle, satisfied, and free.